everyone. Welcome to 3 more chapters of the BFG by Roald Dahl. And there's the cover. I'm having so much fun reading this book. I hope everyone is having fun listening to the book. Thank you for Penguin Random House for allowing me to read this. And let's recap from last week. So what happened last week? Do you remember? We left off with Sophie and the BFG coming up with a plan. And the BFG was going to mix a dream up and they were going to take it to the queen. And when she woke up from this dream about the evil giants, she was going to help Sophie and the BFG get rid of them. That was their goal, right? So let's see if it works. So the next chapter we're going to read today is called Mixing the Dream. So they're going to make the dream and the BFG is going to blow it into the queen's bedroom, right? So let's see if it works. It was dark now. The night had already begun. The BFG, with Sophie sitting on his hand, hurried into the cave and put on those brilliant, blinding lights that seemed to come from nowhere. He placed Sophie on the table. "Stay there, please," he said. "And no chittering. I is needing to listen only to silence when I is mixing up such a naughty, plexicated dream as this." He hurried away from her. He got out an enormous empty glass jar that was the size of a washing machine. Wow, that's a huge jar, isn't it? He clutched it to his chest and he hurried towards the shelves on which stood the thousands and thousands of smaller jars containing the captured dreams. "Dreams about giants," he muttered to himself as he searched the labels. "The giants is guzzling human beings. No, not that one, not that one. Here's one, and here's another." He grabbed the jars and unscrewed the tops. He tipped the dreams into the enormous jar he was clutching, and as each one went in, Sophie caught a glimpse of a small sea green blob tumbling from one jar into the other. The BFG hurried towards another shelf. "Now," he muttered, "I was wanting dreams about giggle houses for girls and about boggle boxes for boys." He was becoming very tense now. Sophie could almost see the excitement bubbling inside him as he scurried back and forth among his beloved jars. And here's a picture of him in his jars, getting all the dreams. Remember that he keeps in the jars? And look how many he has. See that? There must have been 50,000 dreams altogether up there on the shelves, but he seemed to know almost exactly where every one of them was. "Dreams about a little girl," he muttered, "and dreams about me, about the BFG. Come on, hurry up, get on with it. Now where in the wonky world is I keeping those?" And so it went on. In about half an hour, the BFG had found all the dreams he wanted, and he tipped them into the one huge jar. He put the jar on the table, and Sophie sat watching him but said nothing. Inside the big jar, lying on the bottom of it, she could clearly see about 50 of those oval sea green jellyfish shapes, all pulsing gently in and out, some lying on top of others, but each one still a quite separate individual dream. "Now we is mixing them," the BFG announced. He went to the cupboard where he kept his bottles of frobscottle, and from it he took out a gigantic egg beater. It was one of those that has a handle which you turn, and down below there are a lot of overlapping blades that go whizzing around. He inserted the bottom end of his contraption into the big jar where the dreams were lying. "Watch," he said, and he started turning the handle really fast. And here's a picture of him mixing up the dreams. Flashes of green and blue exploded inside the jar. The dreams were being whisked into a sea green froth. "The poor things," Sophie cried. "They is not feeling it," the BFG said as he turned the handle. "Dreams is not like human beings or animals. They has no brains. They is made of zosimus. After about a minute, the BFG stopped whisking. The whole bottle was now full to the brim with large bubbles. They were almost exactly like the bubbles we ourselves blow from soapy water, except that these had even brighter and more beautiful colors swimming on their surfaces. Keep watching, the BFG said. Quite slowly, the topmost bubble rose up through the neck of the jar and floated away. A second one followed, then a third and the fourth. And soon the cave was filled with hundreds of beautifully colored bubbles, all drifting gently through the air. It was a wonderful sight. And I wonder if we can make it look like that with all the bubbles floating around. Let's see. Should we blow some more bubbles? I bet these aren't as pretty as the BFG's bubbles, right? Because they were so colorful. Ooh. All right, that was fun. Now back to the story. As Sophie watched the bubbles, they all started floating towards the cave entrance, which was still open. They're going out, Sophie whispered. Of course, the BFG said. Where to? Those is all little tiny dream bits that I isn't using, the BFG said. They is going back to the misty country to join up with proper dreams. It's all a bit beyond me, Sophie said. Dreams is full of mystery and magic, the BFG said. Do not try to understand them. Look in the big bottle and you will now see the dream you was wanting for the queen. Sophie turned and stared into the great jar. On the bottom of it, something was thrashing around wildly, bouncing up and down and flinging itself against the walls of the jar. Good heavens, she cried. Is that it? That's it, the BFG said proudly. But it's horrible, Sophie cried. It's jumping about. It wants to get out. That's because it's a trogglehumper, the BFG said. It's a nightmare. Oh, but I don't want you to give the queen a nightmare, Sophie said. If she is dreaming about giants guzzling up little boys and girls, then what is you expecting it to be except a nightmare, the BFG said. That's true, right? Oh no, Sophie cried. Oh yes, the BFG said. A dream where you is seeing little chidlers being eaten is about the most frightsome troggle-humping dream you can get. It's a kicksy bog thumper. It's a wopsy grob switcher. It's all of them riddled into one. It is as bad as that dream I blew into the flesh lump eater this afternoon. It's worse. Sophie stared down at the fearful nightmare dream that was still thrashing around in the huge glass jar. It was much larger than the others. It was about the size and shape of, shall we say, a turkey's egg. It was jellyish. It had tinges of bright scarlet inside it. There was something terrible about the way it was throwing itself against the sides of the jar. I don't want to give the queen a nightmare, Sophie said. I is thinking, the BFG said, that your queen will be happy to have a nightmare if having a nightmare is going to save a lot of human beings from being gobbled up by filthsome giants. Is I right or is I left? I suppose you're right, Sophie said. It's got to be done. She will soon be getting over it, the BFG said. Have you put all the other important things in it? Sophie asked. When I is blowing that dream into the queen's bedroom, the BFG said, she will be dreaming every single little thing-a-ling-a-ling you is asking me to make her dream. About me sitting on the windowsill? That part is very strong. And about a big friendly giant? I is putting a nice long gobbet about him, the BFG said. As he spoke, he picked up one of his smaller jars and very quickly tipped the struggling, thrashing trogglehumper out of the large jar into the small one. And then he screwed the lid tightly onto the small jar. "That's it," he announced. "We is now ready." He fetched his suitcase and put the small jar into it. "Why bother to take a great big suitcase when you've only got one jar?" Sophie said. "You could put the jar in your pocket." The BFG looked down at her and smiled. "By goggles," he said, taking the jar out of the suitcase, "your head is not quite so full of grime sludge after all. I can see you was not born last week." "Thank you, kind sir," Sophie said, making a little curtsy from the tabletop. "Is you ready to leave?" the BFG asked. "I'm ready," Sophie cried. Her heart was beginning to thump at the thought of what they were about to do. It really was a wild and crazy thing. Perhaps they would be thrown into prison. The BFG was putting on his great black cloak. He tucked the jar into a pocket in his cloak. He picked up his long trumpet-like dream blower, and then he turned and looked at Sophie, who was still on the tabletop. "The dream bottle is in my pocket," he said. "Is you going to sit in there with it during the travel?" "Never," cried Sophie. "I refuse to sit next to that beastly thing." "Then where is you going to sit?" the BFG asked her. Sophie looked him over a few minutes. Then she said, "If you would be kind enough to swivel one of your lovely big ears so that it is lying flat like a dish, that would make a very cozy place for me to sit." "By gumbo, that is a squackling good idea," the BFG said. And slowly he swiveled his huge right ear until it was like a great shell facing the heavens. He lifted Sophie up and placed her into it. The ear itself, which was about the size of a large tea tray, was full of the same channels and crinkles as a human ear. It was extremely comfortable. "I hope I don't fall down your ear hole," Sophie said, edging away from the large ear hole just beside her. "Be very careful not to do that," the BFG said. "You will be giving me a cronking earache." The nice thing about being there was that she could whisper directly into his ear. "You is tickling me a bit," the BFG said. "Please do not jiggle about." "I'll try not to," Sophie said. "Are we ready?" "Ow!" yelled the BFG. "Don't do that." "I didn't do anything," Sophie said. "You was talking too loud. You was forgetting that I is hearing every little thing-a-ling-a-ling 50 times louder than usual, and there you is shouting right inside my ear." "Oh gosh," Sophie murmured, "I forgot that. Your voice is sounding like thunder and thrumpets." "I'm so sorry," whispered Sophie. "Is that better?" "No," cried the BFG. "It sounds as though you was shooting off a blunderbuss." "Then how can I talk to you?" Sophie whispered. "Don't," cried the BFG. "Please don't. Each word is like you is dropping buzz bombs in my ear hole." Sophie tried speaking right under her breath. "Is this better?" she said. She spoke so softly, she couldn't even hear her own voice. "That's better," the BFG said. "Now I is hearing you very nicely. What is it you was trying to say to me just now?" "I was saying, are we ready?" "We is off," cried the BFG, heading for the cave entrance. "We is off to meet Her Magister the Queen." Outside the cave, he rolled the large round stone back into place and set off at a tremendous gallop. And the next chapter is called Journey to London. So they're putting their plan into place. The great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in a crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear, near the top, where the edge of the ear folds over, and this folding over bit made a sort of roof for her and gave her wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What is more, she was lying on skin that was soft and warm and almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever traveled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet into the air. But he had not yet gone into that whizzing top gear of his when the ground became blurred by speed and the wind howled and his feet didn't seem to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also very warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had changed completely. They were in a green country now with mountains and forests. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look, quick, quick, over there," he said, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the murky darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. "Those is the other giants, all galloping back home after their guzzle," the BFG said. Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of those monstrous brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides they took were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. But this grim encounter made Sophie even more determined to go through with her mission. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow its pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields. There were hills and trees all over them, and occasionally there were roads with the lights of cars moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over it and away, and no motorist could possibly have seen anything except a quick black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is coming close to London," the BFG said. He slowed to a trot, and he began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there were still no lights in their windows. It was too early for anyone to be getting up yet. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never is they seeing me," the BFG said confidently. "You is forgetting that I is doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. No human being is ever catching even the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah," he said, "yes, but you are the first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and so silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly what was going on. They were in streets, there were houses everywhere, sometimes there were shops, there were bright lamps in the streets. There were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on, but nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt in the shadows. He would glide. That was the only word to describe his way of moving. He would glide noiselessly from one dark place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London, his black cloak blending in with the shadows of the night. It is quite possible that 1 or 2 late-night wanderers might have thought they saw a tall black shadow skimming swiftly down a murky side street. But even if they had, they would never have believed their own eyes. They would have dismissed it as an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't there. So he's good at hiding, right? People can't see him. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from his cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her under-the-breath voice. "I is in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You're doing marvelously," Sophie whispered. No, I isn't, he said. I is now completely boggled. I is lost. But why? Because we is meant to be in the middle of London, and suddenly we is in green pastures. Don't be silly, Sophie whispered. This is the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are. You is joking. I'm not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there. You mean we is nearly to the Queen's Palace? Asked the BFG. It's just across the road, Sophie whispered. This is where I take over. Which way? The BFG asked. Straight ahead. The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. Now stop. The BFG stopped. You see that huge roundabout ahead of us just outside the park? Sophie whispered. I see it. That is Hyde Park Corner. Even now, when it was still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner. Then Sophie whispered, in the middle of the roundabout, there is an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse and rider on top of it. Can you see that? The BFG peered through the trees. I is seeing it, he said. Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, you could jump clear over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch, and over the horse and rider, and land on the pavement on the other side? Easy, the BFG said. You're sure? You're absolutely sure. I promise, the BFG said. Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner. Don't get so flushed, the BFG said. To me, that is a snitchy little jump. There's not a thing-a-ling-a-ling to it. Then go, Sophie whispered. The BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scorching across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. It was a gigantic leap. He flew high over Hyde Park Corner and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement on the other side. Well done, Sophie whispered. Now quick, over that wall. Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. We're there, Sophie whispered excitedly. We're in the Queen's back garden. So they made it. They made it to the Queen's palace. So let's see if they get that dream into her bedroom. The next chapter is called The Palace. By gumdrops, whispered the big friendly giant. Is this really it? There's the palace, Sophie whispered back. Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and the tidy flower beds, the massive shape of the palace loomed in the darkness. It was made of whitish stone, and the sheer size of it staggered the BFG. But this place is having 100 bedrooms at least, he said. Easily, I should think, Sophie whispered. Then I is boggled, the BFG said. How is I possibly finding the one where the Queen is sleeping? Let's go a bit closer and have a look, Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly, he stopped dead. The great ear in which Sophie was sitting began to swivel around. Hey, Sophie whispered, you're going to tip me out. Shh, the BFG whispered back. I is hearing something. He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side of it to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through a gap in the bushes, and there, not more than 50 yards away, she saw a man padding softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed as still as stone, and so did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared into the darkness. You was telling me they has no soldiers in the back garden, the BFG whispered. He wasn't a soldier, Sophie whispered. He was some sort of watchman. We'll have to be careful. I is not too worried, the BFG said. These waxy big ears of mine is picking up even the noise of a man breathing on the other side of the garden. How much longer before it begins to get light, Sophie whispered. Very short, the BFG said. We must go pell-mell for leather now. He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on gravel. Suddenly, they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows one flight up, and Sophie, sitting in his ear, had the same view. In all the windows on that floor, the curtains seemed to be drawn. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance, they could hear the muted sound of traffic going round Hyde Park Corner. The BFG stopped and put his other ear, the one Sophie wasn't sitting in, close to the first window. "No," he whispered. "What are you listening for?" Sophie whispered back. "For breathing," the BFG whispered. "I is able to tell if it is a man human being or a lady by the breathing voice. We has a man in there, snorkeling a little bit too." He glided on, flattening his tall, thin, black-cloaked body against the side of the building. He came to the next window, and he listened. "No," he whispered. He moved on. "This room is empty," he whispered. He listened in at several more windows, but at each one he shook his head and he moved on. When he came to the window in the very center of the palace, he listened but did not move on. "Ho, ho," he whispered. "We has a lady sleeping in there." Sophie felt a little quiver go running down her spine. "But who?" she whispered back. The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence, and he reached up through the open window and parted the curtains ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light on its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room, a rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at a face she had seen on stamps and coins and in the newspapers all her life. For a few seconds, she was speechless. "Is that her?" the BFG whispered. "Yes," Sophie whispered back. The BFG wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years to blow his dreams into children's bedrooms. Some windows got stuck, some were wobbly, some creaked. He was pleased to find that the Queen's window slid upward like silk. He pushed up the lower half as far as it would go so as to leave a place on the sill for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and placed her on the window ledge with her legs dangling just inside the room, but behind the curtains. "Now don't you go tip-toppling backwards," the BFG whispered. "You must always be holding on tight with both hands to the inside of the windowsill." Sophie did as he said. It was summertime in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was wearing only her thin nightie. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of her nightie from watchful eyes in the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar from the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now very cautiously, he poured the precious stream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains, far into the room, aiming it at the place where he knew the bed to be. He took a deep breath. He puffed out his cheeks, and he blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it out very, very carefully, like a thermometer. "Is you all right sitting there?" he whispered. "Yes," Sophie murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. "How long will the dream take to work?" Sophie whispered. "Some takes an hour," the BFG whispered back. "Some is quicker, some is slower still, but it is sure to find her in the end." Sophie said nothing. "I is going off to wait in the garden," the BFG whispered. "When you is wanting me, just call out my name, and I is coming very quick." "Will you hear me?" Sophie whispered. "You is forgetting these ears," the BFG whispered, smiling and pointing to his great ears. "Goodbye," Sophie whispered. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward and kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. And that's the end of our chapters for the day. Ooh, we had some more exciting chapters today, huh? So the next chapter that we'll start with next week is called The Queen. So do you think the Trogglehumper dream is going to make it to the Queen and she'll wake up and she'll realize that the BFG is real? What do you think? And then she'll help Sophie and the BFG get rid of the mean giants? I hope so. I think that might work. What do you think? You think their plan's going to work? It's working so far, huh? So join me next week at Tuesday at 4:30, or anytime you can watch on our YouTube channel any of our videos that we've posted on there. And thank you again to Penguin Random House for allowing me to read this today. Thank you guys. Have a great week. Bye-bye.